Evening, friend. Pour yourself something and get comfortable because this one's been sitting with me for a long time. Some stories you tell at dinner, some you keep. This one I kept until now. I was standing in the wings at the Sahara, about to walk on stage for my second set, when Elvis Presley stepped out of the shadows and put his hand on my arm and said something I never told a single soul for the next 15 years. Wait, because what he said wasn't a compliment, wasn't a threat, wasn't anything I expected from a man I barely knew. And the reason he said it is the part that's going to stay with you long after this story ends. The year was 1969, August. Vegas in August is its own particular kind of hell. 105 degrees outside, every hotel on the strip packed to the fire code, and the air conditioning in the showrooms running so hard you could hang meat in them. I was 3 nights into a 2-week run at the Sahara, which I'd played enough times by then to know the room by feel, the sight lines, the particular echo off the back wall that could either work for you or against you, depending on where you stood, which tables filled first on a Tuesday versus a Saturday, which ones stayed empty until the last minute because nobody wanted to sit directly under the speaker rigs. I knew that room the way you know a conversation you've had 100 times. The shape of it stays the same. Elvis was at the International that summer, his first Vegas engagement since 1956, and the whole city was electric about it in a way that Vegas rarely gets electric about anything anymore. Sold out, weeks in advance. Standing ovations before he even opened his mouth, they said. The reviews were extraordinary, not just good, not just favorable, but the kind of reviews that read like people are trying to describe something they don't quite have the vocabulary for yet. I didn't go to see his show. No hat, they said. Not because I didn't want to, I did, genuinely, but because two headliners in the same city during the same week don't go watch each other perform without it becoming a story in the papers the next morning, and I wasn't in the business of making stories I didn't write myself. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from, and what time is it right now? I had 3 songs left in my second set when it happened. I'd just come off the stage for a quick change between numbers, something I did in those years when the set ran long, slip into the wings, let the band play a verse, come back fresh. My stage manager at the time was a compact, efficient man named Lou Adamo, who'd been working Vegas shows since the early 60s and who communicated almost entirely in small nods, each one calibrated to mean something slightly different depending on the angle. Lou could thread you through a costume change in 40 seconds flat and make it look like nothing had happened. I came off the left wing. Lou was waiting with a fresh jacket and his usual expression of a man who has already calculated the next 4 steps, and standing 6 feet behind him in the half dark between the lighting rigs where the stage hands moved between cues was Elvis Presley. I knew it was him before my eyes fully adjusted. There's a quality some people have, a specific weight of presence that precedes their face. Elvis had it more than anyone I'd ever met, except maybe Sinatra, and Sinatra's was a different kind. Frank's presence was deliberate, managed, like a slow burn you could feel from across a room. Elvis's was involuntary. He couldn't help it. He walked into a space, and the space rearranged itself around him whether he wanted it to or not. He was in street clothes, dark jacket, dark trousers, no sequins, no stage gear of any kind. He had a man with him, one man standing back in the shadow of a lighting cable, patient and quiet in the way that good security is patient and quiet when they know it's their job not to be seen. Elvis was holding his hat in both hands, turning it slightly, not nervously exactly, but with the particular focus of someone who needs something to do with his hands while he waits for something he's not sure he's going to get. He looked at me and I looked at him, and Lou, to his eternal credit, read the room in approximately half a second and walked away without being asked. Lou was good that way. I said, Elvis, what are you doing back here? He said, I need to tell you something, Dean. I know this isn't the right time. I know you've got 3 songs left. But I've been trying to find a way to say this for about 2 years, and I figured if I don't say it tonight, I'm probably never going to say it. I said, okay. He said, I owe you an apology. Notice, he didn't say I wanted to thank you, didn't say I have a favor to ask, didn't lead with charm or deflection the way most people do when they're standing in someone's wings uninvited. He led with an apology from a man who in 1969 was arguably the most famous human being on earth. Standing in my wings, holding his hat. I said, for what? And this is the part that took me years to fully understand. He said, for taking up too much of the air. When I came along, I took up all the air in the room for everybody, and I've thought about that a lot, and I think it cost people things they should have had, and I think you were one of those people, and I'm sorry for it." I stood there for a moment. Lou came back with the jacket. I put my arm in one sleeve without looking at Lou, still looking at Elvis. I said, "Kid, that's the most unnecessary apology anyone has ever delivered to me in a dressing room." He said, "Maybe, but I've been carrying it." I said, "Well, put it down. You didn't take anything from me." He looked at me with those dark eyes and said, "I hope that's true." I said, "It is." And then Lou had the other sleeve on me, and I had about 12 seconds before I needed to be back on stage. I did those final 3 songs. The crowd was warm and generous the way Sahara crowds in August always were. People who'd been in the heat all day and were grateful for the air conditioning as much as anything. I don't recall which songs I chose. I remember thinking about Elvis standing in my wings and trying to work out what had brought him there. Here's the thing about an apology that big from a person that famous: it should have felt like a gift, and in some ways it did. But underneath the gift was a question I didn't ask out loud and couldn't stop thinking about once it occurred to me. I'll get to that question. I let out a breath at the end of the last number and took my bow. It was over. I'd had a good night. The crowd was happy. And somewhere in the building, Elvis Presley was either still in my wings or was already gone. He was still there. I walked off to the left, and he was standing against the wall with his man, patient and still the way he'd been before. And he said very simply, "Thank you for hearing me out." I said, "Come have a drink." "I've got a table." He shook his head. He said, "I've got to get back. Priscilla's waiting." And then he put his hat on and walked toward the service corridor with his man, and I watched him go, and that was the last time I ever saw Elvis Presley face to face. Stop for a second, because what I told you just now is the easy part of this story. What I haven't told you yet is the question that kept me up that night, the one I should have asked in those 40 seconds in the wing, but didn't.
The question was this: why 1969? We'd been in the same business, working the same circuit, crossing paths in the same cities since 1956, 13 years. I'd played Vegas dozens of times in that span. Elvis had been in and out of Memphis, Hollywood, the Army, and back again. We'd never once had a real conversation. Why had he waited 13 years to deliver an apology he'd apparently been carrying for 2? And more specifically, what had happened in those 2 years between 1967 and 1969 that suddenly made the carrying feel too heavy? That was the part I couldn't work out. An apology after 2 years of guilt is a human thing. An apology after 13 years of proximity is something different. A specific kind of reckoning I didn't fully understand.
I didn't know the answer that night. I didn't know it for a long time after. But a year later, in the spring of 1970, I ran into a drummer who'd worked with Elvis's band, a quiet, steady man named Gene Ferris, who I'd known peripherally for years. And Gene told me something over a late dinner that reframed the entire encounter in the Sahara wing. He said that in late 1967, Elvis had gone through a period, several months, maybe longer, where he stopped listening to contemporary music almost entirely and went back to the records he'd grown up on: old country, old gospel, and the early pop records from the late 40s and early 50s, the crooners, the people who had been the architecture of American popular music before Elvis himself had walked in and reconfigured it. He'd sit in the back of a tour bus or in a hotel room and just listen, the way you listen when you're not evaluating, but just sitting inside the sound. And in that period, Gene said Elvis had talked about Dean Martin specifically, not in a competitive way, not even in a particularly analytical way, more like someone revisiting a road they'd once passed at speed and not stopped at, slowing to wonder what was down it. I sat with that for a while, because here's the part that hit me hardest, and I'm going to need you to stay with me for this. I'd always assumed, in the way you always assume things about people more famous than yourself, that Elvis Presley had never given Dean Martin a second thought. That's the story you tell yourself when somebody comes along and reshapes the entire landscape of popular music in the space of about 2 years. You tell yourself they're too big to think about you. It's easier that way. But Gene was describing something different. He was describing a man who, at the height of his second major comeback, had gone back to the records of the people he might have displaced, not to gloat, not to measure himself against them, but to sit with them, to really listen. And apparently what he heard made him feel like he owed somebody a conversation. Remember the hat? The way he held it in both hands when I first saw him in the wing? I've thought about that image more times than I can count in the years since. A 24-year-old kid who'd walked into a recording studio in Memphis in 1954 and changed everything, standing in my wing in 1969, holding his hat, asking me to hear him out. That's not the gesture of a man who thinks he is untouchable. That's the gesture of a man who understands finally what it means to take up space in a room and wonder what you displaced. I never told Elvis what Gene told me. By the time I ran into Gene, Elvis was deep into the touring machine of the early 70s, and I had no way to reach him that didn't go through 4 layers of people. And then 1977 came, and none of it mattered anymore in that particular way. But I want to tell you something. That night at the Sahara, walking back to my dressing room after Elvis had gone, I stopped in the corridor and I stood still for a minute in the quiet, not because I was sad, not because I was moved. Exactly, I'm not sure what I was. I think I was recognizing something. The way you recognize something when you finally see it clearly after years of looking at it sideways. What I recognized was this: the music business is a room. Like any room, it only has so much air in it, and most of us spend our whole careers trying to take as much of it as we possibly can. More stage time, more column inches, more real estate in the public imagination. That's the game. Nobody apologizes for playing it. Nobody stands in your wing with their hat in their hands at 10:30 at night and says, I think I took more than my share and I'm sorry for what that cost you. Except Elvis Presley did once, in 40 seconds, in the dark, between my second and third number on a Tuesday night in August. He stood there and gave back something you can't actually give back. And he knew it, and I knew it. And we both pretended otherwise because that was the only way to get through it with any grace. And whatever you want to make of that, whatever it says about him, about me, about the particular strange arithmetic of what fame does to people over time, I've never been able to find a way to set it completely down. If you ever had someone come back and say something they should have said years earlier, or if you've ever been the one who needed to say it and couldn't find the way, drop that in the comments. I'd like to know I'm not the only one who's still working out what those moments mean. And I'll be right here